In compiling their 1936 book of true ghost stories, authors Maude Ffoulkes and Gwladys Townshend asked many public figures for first-hand accounts of spine-chilling spiritual phenomena. This story begins with the assurance that its facts were vouched for by a reputable source, the late Honourable Alec Carlisle. The aristocrat reported the story of a successful publisher by the name of Leonard in London. Despite his humble origins, the ambitious and resourceful man had risen in the ranks of success through determined networking and business acumen. He had over time valued useful contacts more than true friends, and thus managed to raise himself into the upper echelons of society. There had been casualties along the way, in that Leonard had abandoned his former love as no longer worthy of him. The young woman, named Elsie, was poorly educated and had little money. Leonard had decided that the company of this low-born girl was unbefitting of his increasing status, and so, a full 20 years ago, he had phased out their association. By the time Elsie met her early demise, he had already long forgotten her and heard the news with indifference. He did not even send a wreath, in case the florist thought the less of him for having an association with her downmarket suburb. Many years later, Leonard found himself attending the funeral service of a colleague held at London's Kensal Green Cemetery. With its conclusion, he wandered off to find his car, detesting and trying to scrape away the clay soil that clung to his boots. Somehow he lost direction and ended up in an older part of the cemetery, where he was surprised to come across Elsie's dilapidated grave. He remembered that she had had an aunt who lived in the area and had probably paid for the burial. The now untended grave, with its plain weathered cross planted in bare clay and leaning at an odd angle, was a pathetic sight. Its sudden appearance brought about pangs of guilt, and although the publisher tried to suppress his emotions, he came to a decision. He began to feel some kind of obligation to improve the final resting place of his one-time mistress. Of course, he would avoid having his own name identified with the grave of such a low-class woman, and becoming subject to the inevitable gossip and speculation that would no doubt bring. In order to carry out the work anonymously, Leonard decided to act through an agent. He wrote down the number of Elsie's grave and made a plan to call his stockbroker, whom he would request to bring forward funds for a more fitting memorial to her. By the time Leonard returned home that evening, he was feeling rather shaken and emotional, churning over long-forgotten memories of Elsie. Even Bowden, his butler, noticed that he appeared quite upset as Leonard retired to his study. His mind flooded with scenes from the past, Leonard suddenly felt lonely and picked up the phone to invite his stockbroker around for an hour's conversation. But when the operator answered, in his confused state, he found himself requesting Elsie's Kensal Green plot number by mistake. He realised that he was calling the number of Elsie's grave. When relating this story to his sole confidant, Alec Carlisle, Leonard admitted that despite this ghastly realisation, he was unable to move or even replace the receiver. He felt compelled to wait. The operator soon put his call through, and moments later the call was picked up. A voice, at first muffled, then gradually becoming clearer, asked, "Yes, who's calling?" The bemused publisher gave his name. This was met with a small gasp of delighted surprise. The voice, which became even clearer, was unmistakably that of Elsie. The conversation followed the same pattern as his random calls to her 20 years ago. Elsie exclaimed, "Why, it's never you, darling," and asked Leonard if he would like her to come to him. Asking if he wanted her, she effused that, of course, she would come. Leonard was seized by panic. He wanted to refuse, to hang up the phone, but found himself frozen into silence. In the meantime, Elsie continued to speak, telling him that she would not be long, followed by the eerie statement that she had been very far away when he rang. Then there was a click and the line went dead. Leonard was now in a state of shock, but knew that he must await his visitor, speculating when she would arrive and what she would look like. Would she be wearing her earth-stained shroud? Now alone, with Bowden and the other servants in their beds, he poured himself a tall brandy and then another as he listened and waited in apprehension. Eventually, he was terrified to hear his front door quietly open, then close. This outlandish entry, given the locked door, was followed by the sound of footsteps in the hall. The sluggish footsteps dragged a little, as if their owner's limbs had recently been cramped. They came slowly down the passage, accompanied by a current of icy air. Moving closer and closer, the footsteps finally reached the study door, where they paused. There were 3 soft knocks on the door as it began to move, its handle turned from the other side. Leonard did not meet his visitor. He fainted and lay unconscious until the next morning, when he was discovered by Bowden. When discussing Leonard's strange collapse, Bowden later revealed that there were chunks of wet clay sticking to the carpet, tracing a path from the front door down the hallway to his study. The hall mat was all mussed up, and there were streaks of clay on the study door handle, on Leonard's chair, and even on his dinner jacket. But there were no other signs of his midnight visitor. The late Honourable Alec Carlisle reported no revelatory change in Leonard following this ghostly experience. The publisher remained as mercenary and snobbish as ever, with only 2 slight modifications to his behaviour. He refused to either ring up or take a personal call, and he would only attend memorial services, never funerals. He also seemed to suffer a strong aversion to clay, and was once seen to give a chatty gardener a withering look at the mere mention of the word. Paranormal investigators have naturally scoured London's sprawling Kensal Green cemetery in search of Elsie's grave, but without success. However, since these events took place, there has been a decline in conditions there. Aerial bombardment did some damage during World War II, and by the 1960s, the grave sites became known for their spooky, overgrown and ramshackle appearance. The cemetery houses about 65,000 graves, and over recent decades, volunteers have worked to clear and restore monuments and chapels there. But it's easy to see how Leonard's tribute to Elsie could have ended up just rubble over the years.